Hello everyone, welcome back. Today, as part of the settee, we invite you to step into the ways neighbourhood transition is fundamental and is happening by reimagining our homes, our streets and our neighbourhoods, and how all of this is being implemented, governed, maintained by people. In today's conversation, we'll be exploring what decentralised, deinstitutionalised, democratic and kind of regenerative education will look like and can look like and does already look like. So we're going to be joined today by a few amazing people, to say the least. So one of those people is André Anderson, and then we have Fiona McDonald from Matt and Fiona, and we also have Khadijah Carberry from Civic Square. So I just want to give you a little bit of framing around the exhibition and how we're taking this conversation into kind of the space of real kind of collaboration and learning. So we've framed this exhibition from the what is, so what is happening right now, what are the movements that already exist, what are the systems that already exist, to then the what if, which is a really beautiful space of kind of dreaming, and then into the so what, and that space is kind of from deep imagining into action. So I'm your host, Danni Ebanks-Ingram. Lovely to see you all. So I just want to give you a little bit of a kind of overview of what each of our people on our kind of panel and this conversation kind of do. So Fiona is from Matt and Fiona, which is a social enterprise that asks young people how their built environment might improve and empower them to bring that vision to life in their work through building, learning and connecting. They're a small kind of organisation, but they are dynamic, and that's what we love. It's always about kind of these smaller movements that grow and how we are deeply kind of connected into the now and our kind of locality. So then we have André Anderson. André Anderson is the headmaster of Freedom and Balance, which is an art college for artists, for the artists in everyone. And Freedom and Balance helps communities create new knowledge about themselves and the world around them through art and storytelling. Again, a really important point of how we are kind of connecting with our stories, and how we give people the space to do that, to tell their stories and see that their stories are very valid in this movement. And then we have Khadijah Carberry, who I'm going to do the intro from the Civic Square perspective. Khadijah is on the panel to kind of interweave how Beyond School, which is a program that we've been running at Civic Square, how that has kind of been really integrated into looking at what it means to reimagine the economic possibilities of communities and schools, and on that kind of neighbourhood scale and what that actually looks like. So let's get started, I guess. I'd really like to just start with a quote, and that quote is from the Pedagogy of the Oppresses, and the quote is, "Liberating education consists in acts of cognition, not transferal of information." So with that, I'd really like to kind of start our first question with, what if we gave children and young people the autonomy, the knowledge, the skills and the confidence to reimagine the world that we're in now? And what does that look like from the perspective of everyone in this conversation today? So I think, Fiona, are you okay for me to start with you? I know that's a big question to start with, but I find it hard to ask some more questions.
Thank you. Well, firstly, it's amazing to be with this group of people today, and thank you so much for inviting me. That is a big question, and I think potentially it's quite a scary question for most of us, and for most adults anyway, because we have particularly seeing more than ever, that we as adults don't know the answers to what skills, what knowledge the next generation are going to need to operate, to thrive on this planet. And I think the sort of education, at least that I grew up with, was very much that knowledge is power and that it's a finite thing. And so to suddenly think, how are we preparing children and young people for a world that we probably can't even perceive right now is something that a lot of us find really hard to grapple with. and therefore almost don't want to. And I think taking the optimistic view, if we can see that as something to be excited about and not to fear, and to demonstrate that vulnerability to the next generation, is one of the biggest skills we can actually give them, to enable them to feel it's okay not to know what the answer is, but maybe begin to feel that they've got the curiosity and the confidence to be asking the questions that might lead us, and most of all them, to that place. So I don't think I've really answered that question, but it's definitely something that I think about a lot.
No, I think that really has started to unpack that question. I really appreciate your honesty in the space of actually we don't have all the answers, and we in acknowledging that, we then I think start to open the space for young people, for children, to become really embedded in this conversation, and actually for them to see that they are the future and that we're kind of here to aid shifts and support them, but actually they are really important to that. So thank you so much. André, I'm going to pass over to you.
One of the things that I think is one of the biggest failures of modern education is that it has a young person for more or less 18 years and doesn't get them to speculate in any sort of way about futures and playing around. You basically have 18 years to essentially play around and figure things out through play, for you to then take the skills that you learnt through play into the real world and seeing if it works or not. And that never gets used or implemented. I'm going to be talking about play a lot because that's where my head is at. And also as well because I've been looking at where I learnt the most as a kid in school, and it wasn't in school. I actually don't particularly like educational environments, but where I learnt the most was in the playground. And when you're 4, 5, 6 years old, you rehearse different realities quite often. If you're like, all right, cool, we're going to be playing house, or we're going to be playing, we're astronauts and we're in Mars right now. Someone gives out a brief, a 4-year-old gives out a brief to be like, this is the scenario that we're in. And then everyone then takes on that scenario, and people understand hierarchy, leadership, how to follow people understand how to play certain rules to a game. 4-year-olds are figuring this out. So our answers to how education, kind of answering your question about allowing kids to take the reins, they do it every time when it's playtime. It's just that when they go back to school, they then kind of said, all right, cool, now you need to do the real learning. And one of the things that I think that modern education is missing out on is, what if the whole curriculum from when you was 3 years old up until you was 18 was essentially playtime, and you was just basically getting to more and more sophisticated versions of that. So by the time you leave it, it's not you got a whole set of things that you've learned and hopefully you get a job from it, because that's going to be outdated by the time you leave. It's you now have a new way of approaching materials and problems, and because you're so well versed in play and you're so well agile in all these different scenarios, then you're well suited for it. So I do think that kids have those skill sets, and I do feel like they practice those skill sets, but because it hasn't been noticed or codified, that's a skill set that often dwindles as they get older.
Khadijah, do you have any comments that you want to make on that?
As you know me well. Yeah, definitely. I mean, when I started working at Civic Square, my first project was to set up an after-school club, and that was really quite interesting for me. I was educated outside of the school system. I was homeschooled, so kind of stepping into the school to create this model or something was really, it was unfathomable for me because I couldn't even conceive of how the school felt, and it was just a massive learning curve for me. And so I was speaking to a then colleague at the time, and he said, why don't you view it as hacking the system? Maybe that's how you can position yourself in it. Then it wouldn't feel like such an alien environment. It would more feel like a challenge. It would feel like a process of exploring what you can do with what is, and then going to that what if question. So I think our key question for the after school club was, okay, what if we created a space in which children could feel like peers, they could have a sense of autonomy, they could learn through play, we add enough structure to have an after school club, and we more have a theme, and we explore that theme together as, you know, as a collective. And so that was kind of like our first step. And we had 2 different schools we worked with. One was very prescriptive and the other one's much more free, much more creative, and they were much easier to work with in terms of coming in with that playful sense. The other school, we kind of had to school the teaching assistants and say, look, we don't say write in pencil alone and draw with this. We just put the utensils on the table. We say what we're going to do, and we begin that exploration. And then eventually we even saw them stepping into that space of joining in the activities and not feeling like they were there in this authoritarian kind of position of ensuring that everybody played by the rules, etc. So that was quite interesting. I mean, I think I'll finish just with one observation we had from a teacher. So stories of worming, in which you heard before, there is a worm in the far corner of the room, and there was a particular in the particular school, we had a year 1 student that somehow got into the class and we couldn't turn her away because she wasn't meant to be there. And her and another 2 children that were probably just a year older than her, they made dino worm. They created dino worm. They made the best worm. They chose their paints. They created it. They planned it. They had somebody who was the leader of the group, who was the year 1 child, and then somebody else wanted to join, but they were like, okay, well, what do you want to do? Are you going to follow what we're doing? Because we have a plan. If you're happy to follow the plan, that's fine. And you saw that kind of negotiation happening with them. Then afterwards, one of the teachers came and said, I'm dumbfounded that you just put the paints in a bottle, left the paints in the bottle and put some plates and brushes and let them get on with it, and they created this. If I didn't actually see it happening, I wouldn't have believed it possible. So I think this comes back to that point. Children, they're not empty vessels that we have to pour. They come into the world with something to offer, and I think it's our responsibility to give them the skills and create the situations that allows them to draw that out of themselves. So I think education is much more than this is what it is and creating a workforce. It's much more about giving people the ability to draw out their potential. So I think that's what I would say.
I want to add as well, like when you really think about a kid and how rich their mind is to take in new languages, it's the richest your brain is going to get. And I don't just think it's verbal languages, like, okay, cool, you can learn like English and Spanish and I don't know, something else, but it's like they also have a large awareness of like their body and different things that their body can do, and spatial awareness and all that kind of stuff. It's like school is actually the opportunity to exercise all those different ways of communicating and all those different ways of understanding language, because they might actually invent new things that we haven't thought of. So yeah, just kind of honing in on that point. It's like they will always surprise you, and the question is, how do you prepare a space for young people to just be themselves and figure things out?
Thank you. There is something that's just coming up for me while listening to you all speak about this. Is I'd really be interested in kind of hearing a little bit more about actually what your experiences have been when you've been able to create those parameters and you've been able to work with young people and children. What has that actually looks like? So Khadijah, you kind of reflected on what it was like to really get into the like nitty-gritty of like beyond school, and actually not just being about the children, but it being about kind of the systems that we are living and working in. So it would be really great if you could just touch on what those experiences have felt like for you within the work that you do. Fiona, I'm going to pass on to you again.
I'm going to start by referring to, we all had a quick conversation together the day before yesterday, which was really fascinating. We started particularly talking about this point and systems, and how we perhaps all have a slightly different position in relation to systems, and how at least that was our start point in how we work. And so I would just talk from the perspective of Matt and Fiona. We've probably we've been very aware of these systems, but we've potentially played more within them and tried to create change that way. So by that I mean we often work within the school environment. For us, that's been helpful because it's been a way to reach large numbers of young people. It doesn't depend on who has the means or the impetus to turn up, but it means all of those children are included. The downside of it means that there are strict systems in most schools, and maybe similar to what Khadijah was talking about of hacking the system or those guerrilla tactics. It's working out, particularly at the start of a project, what do the teachers want to hear, and that might actually be completely polar to what we're going to do, but we'll tell the teachers what they need to hear to help get them on board, to then be able to be in a position to give those young people the freedom and the agency to make positive change that they want to see in their local environment. That means maybe the downside to that is behind the scenes. There's a lot of research beforehand. There's a lot of figuring out how to play those guerrilla tactics to make that space and that agency for those children. And in the worst case scenario, that means you can get it wrong, but in the best case scenario, that potentially means you can shift things quite far if you do understand the systems that you're playing with. I would say we find it much harder to do that within a secondary setting compared with a primary school setting, where that idea of exploring a theme and in an open-ended way is more welcome than suddenly within secondary, where it feels like there's much greater emphasis on known outputs and known outcomes that young people are expected to reach towards. I think we're very clear in the work we do that there always needs to be a dialogue, but that dialogue has to start with the young people's motivation. What do they want to achieve? What do they want to see happen? And if they have that motivation, if they understand that why, then they will be the ones that push their own learning, and they will learn more skills that way than through any kind of learning by rote, because it's driven by them. So it's not to say that the adults in the space don't have a role to play. They absolutely do. But it's about giving those children and those young people the skills that they want, that they've recognised they need in order to get where they want to go, which is very much, I'd say, the opposite of that kind of learning by rote. And over time, we see teachers get really excited by that, because invariably it's the saddest thing when at the start of a project, a teacher might warn you about certain students, and how ridiculous is that to put a warning on someone under the age of 16, a child, and yet this child supposedly comes with a warning that they'll be the troublemaker. Well, 9 times out of 10, that will be the young person who doesn't want the workshops to finish, is coming back with more and more ideas about the project and where they see it wanting to go. So there's nothing wrong with that young person, quite the opposite. But it's simply that the mould that we've set up is so wrong, it's so excluding, and it means that only the minority often thrive, and they are the minority who will potentially keep the status quo going at a time when we know we need change and we need new thinking. So we're being our own worst enemies, because we're not giving ourselves the opportunity to support that new thought to come through.
So in relation, my work is hardly ever in a school, and then or kind of in an educational institution. And the benefit of that is that when I've worked with schools, you often have to craft an idea so it makes sense within what the kid is already learning, whereby when you're outside of it, you're able to kind of start anywhere, could basically be a starting point. So the things that have been very entertaining for me has been figuring out how you can either look at a world that already exists or a world that could exist, and then make that a plaything for the student or the kid, whoever you're working with. So, for example, Freedom and Balance has a curriculum called Dreamer House, and it came out during the time of the pandemic. And it was essentially a curriculum, architecture curriculum for kids. And actually the origin of that story was it was made, first of all, for my niece. So my niece was, I think, 7 or 8 at the time. And she wanted to, I asked her what she wanted to be when she grows up, and she said she wanted to be an architect. So what I then done is that I created a fake company called Dreamer House. And I started to send her like these monthly briefs to be like, oh, you've now been employed to Dreamer House. Welcome. You now have a new building that you need to design. And there was different things. One of them was a park. One of them was a house. One of them was a library. It's buildings that she's seen before. But what I would do is that I would say that you're going to make this building for a particular person. So, for example, one of the briefs that I sent her is that you have to make a bungalow, but it's not an ordinary bungalow. It's a bungalow with 2 kids, a mum and a dad, which is her family setup. And everyone annoys everyone. So you need to create rooms, or you need to create spaces in this house where everyone can like be at peace, but still be a family. And it's quite a hard brief. Like, it's a very difficult brief. You have to give that to someone who's like 18 or 19. There'll be like 5 weeks planning, brainstorms, mind maps, all that kind of stuff. But she was able to get it intuitively and respond to it within a couple hours, and then send back via video to this fake company her thought process. And what I learned from that is that if you set the premise and you word it in a way that the kid understands, they're open to so many speculative ideas that they'll run with it, whereby it's actually, the older that you get, it's actually harder for them to process that. But yeah, so one of the things that I found, particularly working with educating younger people, is that if you set the premise right, and if the premise like makes sense and it's simple enough, they're able to surprise you in a very big way. And then secondly, there's a curriculum that's not mine, but I recommend researching it. There's a game called the World Peace Game, and the only reason why I recommend it, because I saw it with my own 2 eyes, and it's the wildest thing ever. So basically, this is with older kids, so 15-year-olds, and essentially, it's like a 4 or 5 week game on how to create world peace. And it's a year group, and it's split into like 4 or 5 teams, and they're learning how to negotiate. They learn how to negotiate, trade arms, make peace, save money, spend money, all that kind of stuff. But anyway, the reason why I'm saying it is it's definitely something to look into. Is that like, if you set the premise right, you're able to have kids who really shouldn't be able to speak about economics in such a deep, advanced level, just super fluently. Talk about politics in a way that I still to this day can't speak like them. But the premise was right, and it was structured in a way where they're like, cool, I can operate in this world, I can move in this world. So yeah, I've just learned if you set the conditions right, some really powerful learning can come from it.
There's something really interesting that you've both kind of like touched on around kind of, like creating those conditions. But I think there's also a point to make that so much of what we're thinking about in this work of like transition is that people understand it because they understand like their own lives, and they understand what that means in the everyday. They understand what that means when they step outside of their house. They understand that means about like the built environment that they're then interacting with. Like this huge main road says, oh, okay, I'm either going to have to run across it, or I'm going to have to walk further down the road to cross at the crossing, right? And it says, oh, that's a barrier. So it's like people understand these things, like, and young people from like, they're constantly listening and hearing so much, and they are actually constantly listening. Like there's something about how, we kind of go, oh, they're just in their phones, or oh, the kids are just out there playing. It's like, no, they are in our lives. They are, really so interconnected. And I think there's, it's just something really important about not forgetting that and actually just always kind of giving them the space to truly be and to actually care about their opinion, to care about like what economics means to them, because they'll know, right? They'll be like, oh, I bought this chocolate from someone in the playground at school and they charged me 10p extra than if I'd like gone to the shop, but I couldn't get out of school to go to the shop, so is the 10p extra worth it, right? Like they know these things. I literally have cousins who are doing these things all the time, so it is really important to just remember that kind of value. So I'd like to go on to our next question. So we've kind of spoken about operating kind of like within systems, operating kind of outside of systems, and what that looks like within kind of within those types of spaces. But I wanted to kind of shift now to, what do you think it would look like if we reimagined our neighbourhoods as a site of education? What do you think that means? So kind of touching on what André was saying about working outside of certain parameters, like what do you think that will look like for your work, or what it looks like now?
I think we definitely have to push our perception of school and education beyond the institution, because the institution offers the institution. And if we're going to be thinking about the transition, if we're going to be thinking about people that are able to operate and reimagine the world and the new future, we definitely have to go beyond that space. We have to recognize what it is and then move into the what if. Because it's constantly coming back to that, what this whole space is about today. And so I think the neighborhood, it is a site of education. You can teach a child maths, walking and counting trees and adding the flowers to it. You can do so much. I mean, and even beyond mathematics and writing, we can learn about natural systems. We can learn about social contracts out in the neighborhood and being part of it. So I think we have to envision it as something very different. And also just part of that too is reimagining even what the role of the institution is within that context. But one of the schools we work with, they've said that after working for 6 months with us, they've began rethinking even what their role in the neighborhood is. They see themselves more as an active part of the neighborhood, and they said they feel like they've turned out rather than towards this institutional system. And so even that, I think, for me, that made me really even take a step back from my position and even the institution, the school as an institution. Because what if it becomes a hub? What if it becomes a space in which it's front-facing, it's an anchor within a neighborhood? So all of these questions for me pop up. And also just rethinking what we think education is. Lying down on the grass and looking at the clouds, that's education. I mean, you can talk about the cloud formations if you want to do that, but you could just reflect. And I think all of that for me is education. That's what I think of when I say pushing it beyond into the neighborhood and re-envisioning that as a space of education and learning and sharing and growth.
I got loads to say about this. So if it goes long, I beg you just give me a little signal or something. So one of the things but they're all separated thoughts, so walk with me as we try to connect them together. So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is the neighborhood is a place of education. It's just that we wouldn't call it education. But no matter where you are, you're picking up cultural signals, you're picking up slang, you're picking up ideas and values that are very specific to where you're from. So I'm from Northwest London, and I could tell when someone's from Northwest London just by their temperament, what they say, what they don't say, and so there's a whole learning that you've enrolled yourself to just because you live in a geographical space. One of the things that I think can hold us back for people who are interested in community engagement and education and really, really into it. I think one of the things that hold us back is the language that we carry with it. the language that we're saying in this event is for us. But when we're actually speaking to the people that we're trying to speak to, we need to figure out what words are you already using that is similar to what I'm trying to say, and then how can I evolve your slang that is already your slang? How can I evolve it to accommodate all these extra ideas that maybe your slang doesn't accommodate? So for example, I run an art college called Freedom and Balance. It's for the artist in everyone. I'm the headmaster. One of our first curriculum was called Authors of the Estate. And the idea was, how do you turn a council house into a publishing house? And I wanted everyone in my estate, in St. Raphael's Estate and Chalkhill Estate in Northwest London, to produce their own books, but not just produce their own books, like continually become their own publishing house. So what I first done is that I started putting out posters all over the estate to be like, oh, we're the authors of the estate. I'm the headmaster. We're going to be a publishing house. Like, it's going to be lit. Come sign up. Yeah. No one signed up, and no one signed up for weeks. And we just thought that people wasn't really for it. But often the response was, I'm not an author. I'm not an author. I'm not an author. So we changed that. We took all the language away and just said, yo, aren't you tired of like people telling your stories for you? People's like, yeah, man, I'm sick of that, man. It's like, yo, we need to go tell our own stories. Like, yeah. All right, come meet me at this community center on Saturday, and we're just gonna share our stories. Yeah, and then that's when people came, because no one ain't trying to be an author. That language isn't part of where I'm from. It's only once we started to have those conversations, we then recorded it, that then got transcribed into a book, and then it was only like ages down the line, once the book was in their hands, it's like, oh, you're an author now, by the way. We had to then reintroduce that language to be like, cool, what we just done is called writing a book. This thing you hold in your hand is a book. You're now an author. And once you share this out with your people, that's called publishing. Yeah. So, and some of them rocked with it. So some of them still call themselves authors now. And some of them was like, okay, great, love that. They just love the experience. And one of the things that I think is missing is that there is the discipline that we are interested in, which is education or environmental change or activism or whatever, but there are genres that aren't being developed. So there is a way of communicating the same way how you have music with a capital M, and then you got reggae, you got hip hop, you got classical music, you've got salsa. Like it feels like oftentimes when we're talking about political change, we're all talking about classical music. It's like there's so many different genres that this needs to be reinterpreted by. So yeah, the thing that I think is important when we're talking about our neighborhoods as a place of education, it already is. But who are the people who's going to be introducing the new slang or advancing the slang that's already there for it to accommodate broader ideas? Thank you for listening.
That's so true about language, and really can't be underestimated at all, and identity and what people think is for them or not for them. The other part of this question that I find interesting is it was only through starting to do these types of build projects that I understood that a school might not even be a complete neighbourhood, in the sense that a lot of the building infrastructure is not managed and looked after by the school. It's often looked after by international companies who are, of course, driven by profit. So you'd have these bizarre scenarios where we'd want to hang something in a classroom, and we knew that we should be able to do it in half an hour with the kids, and that would be a great learning for them about physics coming to life and material properties, and also about risk and responsibility and how you measure that up. And then 6 months later, it would still not be hanging in the classroom, and it would be because 20,000 emails later and phone calls were still trying to get through to the right person who's got control of the space that the children are in. So their classroom doesn't even belong to them, in the sense that their teachers, their head teachers, don't actually have any ownership or any agency over that space. It's looked after by a company that's looking after spaces all around the world and is driven by profit. So my point in this is there's so much that children and young people can learn from being able to take ownership of their built environment, but our systems have become so complex that even the school itself can't change the light bulbs, can't paint the walls, can't dig up part of the playground and turn it into a garden because it's not theirs to do so. And then you look at that and how that unfolds in neighbourhoods with so much social housing, where it's the same, that communities are having to fight these often invisible systems, these faceless systems, where there's no one person to go to ask for permission. So a lot of what we do through these projects is trying to unpick these systems much earlier so that the children can have agency, but alongside that also realising the huge learning experience there is in understanding these bigger systems that are at play and how you can actually affect change within them that isn't as straightforward as I want to paint the wall yellow, I'm going to go and get some yellow paint, or I want to plant a flower garden outside, I'm going to get some seeds. It's actually how you get those permissions, or you don't, which is the other interesting side, and I'm not sure which side I sit on, but I've definitely come in from the side of playing by the rules or working out when is the right time to break a rule to then show the sense that makes and ask for forgiveness and use that as a model to go forward, or whether you just break those rules. But I think that point about neighbourhoods is so important and makes so much sense, and yet we as a society seem to have forgotten our instincts around, of course, the neighbourhood should be the community through which you learn. You should learn from all the members of it. But we've made these systems so complex that often even to get a visitor to come into school means jumping through so many hoops, that young people are really isolated, teachers are really isolated, and we see how that's now playing out. So I think it's really that sense of how can we unpick these bigger systems and fight back that this is really actually ridiculous. It's either a comedy or a tragedy, but maybe looking at it with humour and pointing out how ludicrous it is one way to start to make this change. And I also felt naive that I didn't know that. No, the head teachers knew it, the teachers knew it, but I didn't realise that schools don't have agency over their own walls and roofs, and that seems completely mad.
I think there's definitely a point there to be made around how systems all like kind of replicate themselves, right? So it's like you can look at the like schooling system in this like more kind of traditional sense, or through like it being more of an institution, and then actually then you look at our like political like connection with where we're at right now, and all of these things kind of replicate themselves over and over and over again, just like different forms of like what it means to be like, you know, in an institution that's like an educational space, or an institution that is like a space where you're trying to get your voices heard, or it's more political. But all of these systems are kind of, you know, nudging themselves really, especially under like the hands of capitalism. With that being said, I think there's one more comment from Khadijah as well, and then we'll go into like our last kind of question.
I just want to invite some of the listeners to come and sit down. We've got a few empty seats, so feel free to populate the seats. Thank you so much. Just on that point, I think that was a massive learning curve for us. Being able to bring people into the school, sometimes that had fulfilled everything that they needed to fulfill. And sometimes it would create a massive backlog. We would start sessions late, finish late, because sometimes every single time we brought them in, we would have to do the exact same checks, even though that person had been in the school so many times, including myself. And it just was really quite tedious. It was really challenging, and it really forced us to kind of maintain that North Star that I think was spoken of earlier on in the earlier panel, of what we were there doing. We were creating a space in which children could see themselves as part of that neighbourhood transition. Because maybe if not, it would have been really hard, because there's so many. And I mean, we even fed this back to one of the schools. We said, look, every single time we came, you would make us fill out the same paperwork, even though we had what was required of us, and we would start sessions late. And I think you're talking about offering children a chance to see education a different way, but you're not even facilitating that. What do you think about that? Why do you have these systems in place? And he said, I actually don't know. That's just how it is. And I was like, well, I think we need to start questioning why it is that way. especially if you're saying you want to open up your school to the neighbourhood, because that itself is a massive barrier, and it actually stops incredible people from wanting to come and interact with your children. So I think that's like a really important thing, and that shows that the change and transformation, it's so nested. We can come in as creatives and as artists and other practitioners to bring these things to the schools, but the schools also have to challenge some of their own systems. And I think we have to be prepared to ask, well, why? And that was massive for us, because we were expecting kickback, but we didn't get any kickback. He just said, I actually don't know.
Can I say something? Are you running out of time? That also as well is how I picture this work, is that there are different squadrons or different armies in different parts of the battlefield. So you've got people who are in the system, who are in the actual fortress. So I'm sorry for using this language, but they're in this fortress and they're doing the war there. And then you've got people outside that are like the adjutants, and they're just doing things outside that draw the, I don't want to say the enemy, but like, play with my metaphor, like it draws the enemy out, right? Most of what I do and what I enjoy to do is outside, and I think those two ways of operating is very, very important. Because even when you think about school, a school in and of itself wasn't something that the government thought of in the first. We're talking about that public schooling. It came from my understanding, it came from someone called Robert Rakes, who essentially wanted to, like, because kids, the moment they were 4 years old, was working, right? And like Robert Rakes was like, we need to have like a period of time where they're learning and developing. So he's like, cool, we're going to get them to like sit down and read. The only time they could do that was on Sunday, and the only book that was available for them to read was the Bible. So that's why you get Sunday school. And then Sunday school then became like the model for public schooling, which then, I don't know, do the research, I might have got the whole thing wrong, but that's my understanding of public schooling. So it started outside. It wasn't this thing where the government's like, oh, we should have free education for all. There was an adjutant that then became establishment, and now there's new adjutants outside which will eventually become establishment. So think about it where it's like, sometimes there are things that need to be faced head on, and sometimes it's like you can give yourself the permission to be like, no, I'm just going to do this thing and I'm going to keep doing it, with no like wonder of what's happening over there. And then sometimes that ends up creating a strong enough environment for the change you want to see to occur.
Thank you. So we've just got like a few minutes left, and Khadijah, you mentioned North Star, and that was like my last question. I just wanted to hear from all of you of like, what is your North Star? What is the thing that keeps you going? What is the thing that keeps kind of pushing your work forward, I guess?
Yeah, another big question.
Yeah, sorry.
I think, and this I don't want to speak for everyone else, but I'm sure it's seeing what children and young people come up with when they're given these spaces and these contexts in which to explore and be curious. We often talk about holding space, but I've, in particular in the last few years, become really interested in holding risk, both in a very banal paperwork way, but also who's willing to stick their neck out and hold risk. We do a lot with where we give 6-year-olds drills and saws, and invariably there will be people that ask, why on earth do you do that? But in 6 years we've never had an accident. Touch wood, we never have an accident. And I think that's because generally, like for most human beings, if you give children responsibility, they rise to it. They really engage their mind. They want to see how far they can push themselves. And you see them grow in front of you. In that moment, 2 kids who might have been messing around with some pencils trying to stab each other, you give them a drill. They don't do that. They know that would really hurt the other person. But not many people, not many organisations are willing to hold that risk, not in today's world. And yet that's what I believe a lot of children need, is that opportunity to take risks, to stretch themselves and to learn through taking that responsibility. So For me, particularly as I get older, I notice myself getting more risk averse, and probably if I'd known some of what would happen over the next few years, maybe I actually wouldn't have started out on the projects that I've done. And yet I'm so grateful that I did start when I was young enough to have less of a sense of risk, because of where it's led me to now. And it's that experience of knowing and holding space for that risk and knowing actually it's been absolutely fine is what keeps me going. But what I notice and finding increasingly rare, and what excites me so much about meeting everybody today, is finding fellow individuals who are happy to hold that risk for young people.
Amazing, thank you so much, Fiona. And we will finish with André, your North Star.
You sure? Okay. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is shared cultural memory. And what I mean by that is I'm born in 92, and if someone was born around about that time, they'll be like, okay, you probably watched Keenan and Kel, or you probably listened to this kind of music, or you probably had Pokemon cards, whatever. There's a shared childhood that even if I never knew you, we still had the similar upbringing. And then you'll be able to tell if someone is a millennial or a gen whatever, yeah. And the thing that I'm excited to see introduced, which I would love Freedom and Balance to introduce in some way, is like a shared cultural process. So it's like not just like cultural moments where you consume something, but cultural moments where you all made something. So if someone's like, oh, I'm 44, and someone's like, oh, you probably wrote a book, or you probably like done this podcast during this time. Or it's like, I'm trying to figure out how learning goes beyond school in a traditional sense and becomes these cultural moments that like everyone was a part of in building. So yeah, that's my joy. That's the thing that I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah, I'm gonna give my North Star. I think my North Star is like a picture where we have this future that's gone way beyond the challenges and the crisis that we are in now, and people are just doing their everyday thing, and there is a new generation that just cannot imagine the time that we're in now. I think that's my North Star, definitely.
Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing those North Stars, because I really think it's important that we finish things on where we're going and into that kind of so what, and what actually is really kind of keeping us doing what we're doing, because that's the thing that inspires not even just the next generation, but that's the things that inspires each other, right? I think something to really hold on to. So thank you all for listening. Thank you so much, Khadijah, André and Fiona. And thank you all for everyone who's in the room and those who are also listening on